My topic today is pursuing the North American agenda. What is it? If you ask your congressman about it, he may say it doesn't exist. He may say he never heard of it. Or he may say, don't worry, there's nothing to worry about. Well, today we want to connect the dots and see if there's something real behind the idea of a North American community. President George Bush, one of the first things that he did after he went into the White House in 2001 was to go up to Quebec, Canada, where he signed the Declaration of Quebec City. This declaration established our commitment to hemispheric integration. I want you to understand that the language of globalism is very particular. They use a lot of very special words, and most of what I tell you today will be quotes from their documents. Integration is no longer anything to do with race. Integration now means economic integration. And the purpose of the Quebec Declaration was to be a launching pad for what was called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, in which they were going to economically integrate all of the Western Hemisphere. Now that became pretty hard to do when we not only have communists running Cuba, but also Venezuela. The American people were not going to go for this. So I think they have scaled down their goal to the North American community as the first step. In March of 2005, President Bush went to his ranch in Texas, where he invited Mexican President Vicente Fox and Canadian Prime Minister Martin. And then they went over to Waco, and they issued a press release announcing the formation of the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America. Now, this was not a treaty to be submitted to the Senate. It was not a bill to be submitted to Congress. It was not even an executive order. It was just a press release. So many people thought, big deal. They got together, had a good time, and issued a press release. A couple of months later, the Council on Foreign Relations Committee, in May of 2005, issued a 59-page document which set forth a 5-year plan developing the Security and Prosperity Partnership to establish by the year 2010 a North American economic community. Again, community is their word, with a common outer perimeter, that's another favorite word, in order to achieve the freer flow of people within North America. They used the word integrated repeatedly. It was presenting an integrated strategy to receive, quote, an open border for the movement of goods and people within which trade, capital, and people flow freely. The CFR document calls for a seamless North American market, allowing in the Mexican trucks, of course, bringing a lot of foreign aid to foreign countries, and a tribunal for North American dispute resolution. You see, when you have a common market or free movement of trade, you have to have a government over it to set the regulations. That's what the Founding Fathers decided and realized when they established the United States Constitution. We had 13 individual states, each had its own trade rules, and they wanted the people who made things in Massachusetts to be able to sell in Virginia. That was the impetus for the writing of the United States Constitution. But you have to have a federal government over it to set the rules, to say, yes, we believe in private property. Yes, we honor the sanctity of contracts. And that was the start of it. But if we have a North American community, it will indeed have to have a tribunal for the settlement of disputes. Now, who cares what kind of document the CFR is releasing? They're putting out hundreds of policy papers every year. Well, what makes this one different is it was posted on the U.S. State Department website. Now, that gives it an authenticity by the Bush administration. And so it's something we need to pay attention to. This was the spelling out of the details of the Security and Prosperity Partnership. Then in June of 2005, Senator Lugar of Indiana was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he called a friendly hearing to hear from the author of the CFR document. Now, Senator Lugar is a Republican, but unfortunately he's a Rhodes Scholar, and he never saw a UN treaty that he didn't like. So we invited in this American university professor, whose name is Robert Pastor, who was the principal author of the CFR document. Now, he didn't just come out of the woodwork somewhere. He had served on the Linowitz Committee, which gave away the Panama Canal. And I'm sure you remember that that was a big issue with us. We also discovered, among the people who worked on this CFR document, that the principal Republican was William Weld, former governor of Massachusetts, who was so un-American in his attitudes that Jesse Helms kept him from being confirmed as a U.S. ambassador. And the principal Democrat on the commission, oh, this is bipartisanism, was Doris Meissner, who was Bill Clinton's head of the immigration agency, and she's the one who arranged to naturalize a whole lot of people who never should have been naturalized without the appropriate documents and investigation in order to do it in time to vote for Bill Clinton for president in 1996. So that's the group that authored this CFR document. And Robert Pastor is also the author of a book called Toward a North American Community. The plot thickens. In June of 2005, Michael Chertoff, who was our Homeland Security Secretary, went up to a Security and Prosperity Partnership in Ottawa, where he said, "We want to facilitate the flow of traffic across our borders." Now, you know, he's the one who recently said that he doesn't think we'll build a fence on our southern border, even though it was overwhelmingly voted by law by Congress and signed by President Bush in a famous photo op just before the election of 2006. In March of 2006, President Bush went for his spring frolic down to Cancun, Mexico. And I know all about this because one of my sons had taken his family for the spring frolic, and they were at the same hotel. They did have a fence around the hotel. You see, fences are good when we are protecting our president. And there at Cancun, President Bush met with Vicente Fox again and the new Canadian Prime Minister, Harper. And they issued another press release that said this is the first anniversary of the Security and Prosperity Partnership. So it must be real if it had a first anniversary. Then in May, a couple of months later, George Bush made a televised speech in which he said flatly that we cannot have any border security unless we have a comprehensive bill. Now, comprehensive is another code word of these people. Comprehensive means that they won't do anything at all, even pretend to do anything about closing our border to illegal entry, unless we also legalize the 20 million illegal aliens who are in this country and bring in millions of additional guest workers. The bill that was passed by the Senate, fortunately did not become law last year, would let in 66 million guest workers, according to the figure worked out by the Heritage Foundation. Meanwhile, in the Commerce Department, they set up 20 working groups to implement the Security and Prosperity Partnership. And they don't want to tell us what's going on. The woman in charge of this, a woman named Jerry Word, said the Bush administration does not want them distracted by calls from the public. Now, their announced plan is to harmonize our administrative law. And again, that is another word used by the globalists. We don't want to be harmonized with the laws of other countries. If anybody's going to do any harmonization, they ought to harmonize with us. We don't want to harmonize with them. The Security and Prosperity Partnership has had several other meetings. They had one very secret one at Banff. I'm sure some of you have been to Banff. I think one of the most beautiful places on Earth in Canada and the Canadian Rockies, and it's very easy to keep the press out there, so no telling of what they were planning. Now, there have been people who say, when you talk about this, that you're just conspiracy-minded. Now, this can't be a conspiracy because you can find it all on the White House website. Just go look for it. All these press releases are right there. And by definition, a conspiracy has to be secret. It's not secret. It just has not had adequate reporting in the press. So these plans are taking shape, and what we're doing today is to connect some of the dots for this economic integration with Canada and Mexico. We hear people talking about the NAFTA superhighway. And again, if you will ask your congressman, they'll say, oh, that doesn't exist. You're making this up. Well, there's a lot about it on the web, and it doesn't exist today. But it is in the planning stage. And the contract has already been let for the Texas portion. The state of Texas Transportation Agency signed a contract with a Spanish company, please excuse my Spanish, Centro Concesiones de Infraestructuras de Transporte, to build a 10-lane wide highway that will go from the southern border of Texas with Mexico up to the Oklahoma border. And this will have lanes for autos and for trucks and for railroad cars and for all those other kinds of pipelines and electric lines that go alongside of highways. And it will be a limited access highway. This is not to facilitate traffic within Texas. If you want to go from Austin to Dallas, this is no help to you at all. This would be a very limited access 10-lane highway that will require the eminent domain taking, another word you need to be familiar with, the taking of your private property of 500,000 acres of farm and land in Texas at a cost that may rise as high as $30 million. Of course, the government officials don't need to worry about these takings anymore since the Supreme Court decision in the Kelo case last year, which you know about. Now, when you build this 10-lane highway from Mexico up to Oklahoma, you don't think it's going to stop and say everything exit here like some of these highways do. You're sure that it's going to be continuing up through what will eventually be called the NAFTA superhighway. The plan is to bring it on up through Oklahoma, Missouri, and all the way up to Canada. We don't read much about this in our American press. However, thank goodness for the Internet. We can find quite a bit about it in the Canadian and the Mexican press. The foreign press seems to know all about it. There have been extensive Mexican articles which have described this as a plan that will require no treaty. Nothing's ever going to be submitted to Congress. It's just going to be done. That's all, just presumably by press release. And a particularly scholarly article written in Spanish and published in Mexico describes it very clearly. First you have the customs office where the foreign goods come in, and then you have a common market, and then you have a monetary and economic union, and then you have to have the adoption of a single currency, like they have in Europe, called the euro. And they've already named this common currency when we combine our dollar with the Canadian dollar and the Mexican peso. It's to be called the Amero. The first mention we can find of the Amero is in a Canadian publication, but it's widely used by Robert Pastor, who is the author of this whole idea of a North American community. And all of this is a step toward the building of a North American community without any borders between the three countries. The model is what's happened to Europe. Now, Europe started out with just some trade agreements between some major industries, and then they decided, wouldn't it be great to have a common market? So they had a common market. And then they found, as you always have to find, when you have a common market, you've got to have a governmental structure to handle the disputes and enforce the regulations. So then they had to go to the European Union. And then they had to decide they had to have a constitution. And of course, all this was done by the elites. It was almost never submitted to the people. There is nothing democratic about this project whatsoever. Now, who's going to write up the NAFTA highway? Just last week, President Bush announced the opening of our borders to the Mexican trucks. Now, one good thing you can say for Bill Clinton, can't think of anything else at the moment, but one good thing he did was to keep out the Mexican trucks. And now Bush has opened it to 100 Mexican trucking companies. Now, that doesn't say how many trucks. It could be thousands of trucks. This is actually very scary to me. I don't know how much driving you all do on the interstate, but I've been counting the trucks on the interstates I drive on, and I can tell you it's one vehicle out of 10 is a big 18-wheeler. And it's quite something to dodge around these big trucks. And the idea of the highways having the Mexican truck drivers is really very scary to me. American truck drivers have to meet strict requirements that include enforcement of hours, regular physicals, age limits, and drug and alcohol tests. Now, Chertoff assures us that he's going to send some inspectors down to the border to check the Mexican trucks when they come in. My guess is they'll check 1 or 2% of them. But in any event, nobody has any way of knowing how many hours the Mexicans have been driving before they get to our border. Mexico has no good drug and alcohol testing. They've never had any supervision of their trucking industry. So this is the problem. Over the last few years, we have had a lot of accidents that were caused by the Mexican drivers, both legal and illegal, and particularly as a result of the language difference. And I can tell you that the most tragic highway accident in the history of the Midwest was a language-caused accident. A Mexican truck driver, an illegal alien, was driving his big truck up the highway, and he had something hanging off the back of it. And you know how the truck drivers all talk to their good buddies on their, whatever it is they have in their hand. And they were telling him, buddy, you've got something hanging off the back of your truck. He didn't speak English. He didn't understand them. The thing came off the back of the truck, went under the van right behind him, hit the gas tank, and 6 children were incinerated like that. The mother and father just barely got out. It was a rather famous accident. And Chertoff claims that the Mexican truck drivers are going to have to speak English. I'll believe it when I see it. He's cheated us on other things, and I can't believe that's going to happen. Now we have the idea of making Kansas City a port. Now, I know they stopped teaching geography in the schools a long time ago. Maybe you all don't know where Kansas City, Missouri is. But I can tell you there isn't any ocean there. The only waves they have are the amber waves of grain that Lee sang about in our song. And the idea is to make Kansas City a port. Now you need to understand that this NAFTA highway, when they get it built up through Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri, is not to benefit Mexico. That is not the point of it at all. It is to benefit China and bring in the cheap Chinese goods. And the whole game plan is to bring the cheap Chinese goods across the Pacific and dock them at a West Coast Mexican port called Lázaro Cárdenas, bring them on the railroad that's already in place up to the Texas border, then put them on the NAFTA highway, and the first time they get inspected is in Kansas City in a customs facility that will be operated by the government of Mexico. Now, the only reason we know about this is that one of our eagles, one of our enterprising eagles, used the Missouri Sunshine Law to get a Freedom of Information request, and she got a hold of the emails between the Kansas City City Council and the Mexicans. And that showed that they absolutely intended to have a Mexican-operated customs facility. And then from this port in Kansas City, the goods will be distributed throughout the United States and on through to Canada. And this is what's called an evolving trade corridor. Now, the port in Mexico is already operated by Hutchison Whampoa, and you may recognize that name as the name of one of the giant Hong Kong shipping companies that already operates the ports at both ends of our Panama Canal. And so Mexico, in the beginning, was expected to pay for some of these expensive screening machines that would do this screening in Kansas City. They've now reneged on it, and the Missouri governor just made a trip to Mexico to try to talk them into paying for it. But you can bet that Kansas City has already applied to the federal government for the taxpayers to pay for it. Now we want to address the matter of letting the foreigners own the infrastructure of our country. This Texas Trans Highway that has become very controversial in Texas in the last couple of months was the state of Texas selling the right to control this toll road and collect tolls for the next 50 years to a Spanish company. And they've been having big protest rallies trying to undo the contract, and I don't know what's going to happen on that. You remember a couple of years ago when we discovered that our government was going to allow Dubai Ports World to own 22 of our ports on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. And there was a big uproar, and we got the government to stop that. This sale of our infrastructure to foreigners is supposed to be managed by a government agency called CFIUS. That stands for Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Now, the survey shows that they have handled 1,500 applications for foreign acquisitions since 1988, and they have only rejected one. So you can see that the foreigners are doing quite well in getting control of our infrastructure. Not only this Spanish toll road, but an Australian company bought a 99-year lease on Virginia's Pocahontas Parkway. An Australian-Spanish partnership paid almost $4 billion to lease the Indiana toll road for 75 years. And I can tell you when I went to Indiana that we lost 3 wonderful conservative congressmen in Indiana. They said the main problem was the war, but the second problem was the controversy over the toll road. Chicago sold a 99-year lease on 8 miles of the Chicago Skyway for $1.8 billion. The tolls from the U.S. side of the tunnel between Detroit and Windsor, Canada, belong to an Australian company. And now you may wonder where the foreigners get all this money. There are plenty of rich foreigners. In fact, most of the other countries of the world have an economy that has a handful of very, very rich people, and then the rest of the people are very, very poor. That's the way Mexico is. That's the way most of the other countries of the world. So there are lots of billionaires. I saw a piece on public television last week about the resort at Dubai that is frequented by wealthy foreigners. And I've been to a lot of extravagantly luxurious places, but I have never seen anything like the ostentatious luxury of Dubai, where the foreigners, the wealthy billionaire foreigners, like to go for their vacation. So they've got the money. Now, why do the Americans go for these deals? Well, it's very attractive to the American politicians, like the legislators and the city council people and the governors, because they get the upfront money they can spend right now while they're in office. And pretty soon their term will be over and they'll be gone, but we'll be paying the tolls for the next 50 or 75 years. So that's why the foreigners like it. And not only being able to spend the money that comes from the contract, but also the way the money that flows into the campaigns of all the people who have to vote on this. It is a real scandal that is waiting to come out. Orange County, California, sold a piece of its highway to a French company. And then they discovered a provision in it that's in some of these contracts of do not compete. And they found they did not have the right to improve their other roads that were in the vicinity of this toll road that they leased. And Orange County had to buy back their lease at a cost of twice as much as what they sold it for. We've now discovered that there is a do not compete provision in the Texas contract, and that may be one of the ways that they can get out of it. So at risk are all of the infrastructure of our country, the roads, the tunnels, the bridges, the mass transit, the rail transportation, the airports, the ports. There's just this tremendous incentive to sell it off to foreigners. And the latest is that they want to sell the lottery. Illinois is now trying to negotiate to sell the lottery to some foreign country, which means the present regime, whom we don't like a bit, will get all the goody money up front, and people will be buying lottery tickets that'll be paid to the foreigners for the next 50 years. Another aspect of this economic integration, and one which was specifically called for in the Council on Foreign Relations document that I referred to, is to put all the illegal aliens into our Social Security system. Yes, you heard me right. Put the illegal aliens in our Social Security system. Again, there is a code word for this. It's called totalization, and that's what it means. And this is a special project that is very much supported by President Bush. In fact, at the Republican platform in New York City in 2004, I tried to put in a provision to bar totalization, and the White House sent 3 policy people over from the White House to argue with me for 30 minutes on why totalization was such a wonderful thing. Now, it would break our Social Security system if it isn't already bankrupt. And what they will tell you is, oh, we have totalization agreements with other countries, so we need one with Mexico too. A totalization agreement is designed for a very few people who do work part-time in 2 countries and pay into the retirement system in both countries, and if you totalize them, then they don't get cheated by one of the other countries. But our relationship with other countries in Europe is nothing at all like Mexico. In the first place, the plan is to let the Mexicans come into our Social Security system after only 18 months of work in this country. You know you have to work 10 years before you go into the Social Security system. And under the Mexican plan, they have to work 24 years before they get into their Social Security system. Also, in Mexico, the person who pays in only gets back what he paid in, plus interest. And you know about our own Social Security system, it is heavily skewed to give more benefits to the people at the lower income levels than the higher income levels. So there's nothing comparable about it. And furthermore, most of the illegal aliens were either unemployed when they came here or worked very low-paid jobs, didn't pay into a retirement system, and really have no equity there at all. George Bush signed this secretly in 2004. The only reason we know about the text of it now is that some senior citizens group I never heard of filed a Freedom of Information request and did get it released. So we know it's out there, and we are dependent on a bill that has been proposed by Senator Ensign in the Senate and Congresswoman Barbara Cuban in the House to try to stop this from happening. Because the deal is that the day Bush puts his actual signature on it, Congress only has a 60-day window to veto it. And that is a terrible system that we ought to deal with. I think that the Bush totalization plan would lure even more illegal aliens into this country than we already have. Now, the last dot that we want to connect to this plan for a North American community is comprehensive immigration reform. This is a plan really to blur the borders between us and Mexico and China. 10% of Mexicans are already living in this country, And according to the Pew Research, 50% of them would like to live in this country. Don't blame them for that. But at any rate, we've got the right to protect our own borders. And one of the really bad effects of this is that it will overnight make us a bilingual country. And we do not want to be a bilingual country. The English language is a major unifying cause. Our national motto is E pluribus unum. That means out of many, one. And the English language is a major factor in that. You remember a couple of years ago, Al Gore, who was kind of rusty on his Latin, thought that E pluribus unum meant out of one, many. But that isn't what it means at all. It means out of many, one. And we want to be united. And we have a unique, wonderful system in this country that has produced more freedom and more prosperity than any other country in the rest of the world. That's why they all want to come here. And they can copy our model if they want to have freedom and prosperity. But there's no way we can really significantly help them or us by opening up our borders to people who do not share our commitment. We have people who are committed to a certain set of cultural values. And they include private property and respect for contracts and respect for the rule of law. And that is not what they understand in Mexico at all. They have an economic system that is based on bribery. You pay people off all up and down the line. That's the way the whole economy operates. And then they have this country with billionaires at the top and the rest of the people kept in abject poverty. And it doesn't solve any, in fact, it assists them to continue their bad policy if we solve some of their poverty problems by admitting them into this country. We have just a wonderful system that is proven better than anybody else. And we need to maintain our sovereignty and our independence and our respect for the Constitution. We need to reject all ideas for amnesty and this fake called guest worker, which is simply opening up the doors. But I think you can see now that we connect the dots, that all these pieces fit together, whether it's calling for a North American economic community, whether it's building the NAFTA superhighway, whether it's selling off our infrastructure, whether it's making our port in Kansas City, or whether it's having comprehensive immigration reform. And the whole purpose of it is to let in millions of people, destroy the wonderful heritage that we have. And I believe that it is our obligation, the people who've enjoyed the goodies of this wonderful country, to know and to act to protect this country from the people who I guess really don't like it. They want to change our favorite song from God Bless America to God Bless North America. And that's not what we're all about. We believe in the United States of America and pledge allegiance to our republic and to the nation for which it stands. And this is what we need to be alert to, and I hope you will talk up this issue until it becomes an issue on the national campaign trail so that every candidate will have to address it. We want to protect our sovereignty, our freedom, and our prosperity.